So I would suggest that generally it's the cold weather plants, things like lettuce and broccoli and carrots and beets have critical synergies with the soil life that can do more well in colder temperatures. So, if you have to throw numbers at it, 50 is a good baseline, 55 is optimal for those guys. For the warm weather plants, 60 is optimal. Sorry, 60 is a baseline, 65 is a good target to look at. So that's pretty late in the year in many cases before you get that kind of soil temperature. And I've got no problem if you want to use techniques to raise soil temperature like, Reams or, plastic or, coop houses, things like that. But I think there is definitely a connection between soil temperature, biological activity, and overall plant growth. I think I mentioned this yesterday. I didn't know if I said it directly. There's a guy named Reams who was one of the elders, passed in the 80s. Among other things, he was able to accomplish, which are almost impossible to believe. He was able to grow a green bean from planting the seed to harvesting the bean in 3 weeks. Anybody know how long it takes to grow green beans? A little bit longer than that. Yeah, a little bit longer than that.
I'm sorry, what was his name?
Reams, R-E-A-M-S. The way he was able to do that was through applying a foliar spray every 15 minutes. So he had a little mister that would turn on every 15 minutes. And he considered himself to be in like kindergarten or first grade as far as understanding really how to work with plants. He's like, when people really understand this stuff, we'll be able to do it in hours. Which sounds totally ridiculous, except he was a student of Einstein's and, was a clairvoyant and was, had some levels of perception. And he was able to do some really, really remarkable things. So, the basic point here is that plant growth is not regulated by time. It's regulated by nutrient availability. And it may be counterintuitive, but I think I gave this example yesterday with the zucchini or yellow squash seedlings. You put your seedlings into the bed that are 2-3 weeks old, and you don't have enough seedlings and the bed's too long, and so you put some seeds in at the end of the bed, and then 3 weeks later those seeds you just put in are as big as the seedlings you put in at the same time. We've seen this happen, many of us, numerous times, and never quite put the dots together. You do an early succession of something and you do a later succession, and the later succession catches up to the early succession and everything comes in all at once. Anybody ever had that experience? Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, Reams was very clear about the fact that the younger the plant was able to reach maturity, the earlier in its life it was able to get that level of productivity. Generally, that correlated with better vigor, better health, better long-term potential. If the plant took a long time to struggle to get to setting fruit, it had used up a lot of its energy and generally had a lower overall potential going forward. We are on the middle of page 3, general parameters. Leaf density, I think was where I got left off talking about perennials. Leaf sap color, darker color means more chlorophyll. More chlorophyll means the plant is able to make more sugar. We talked about that. Mg, B, and K, magnesium, boron, and potassium are associated with this. So then again, you can do the same thing we talked about earlier with solubilizing, etc. Except with the boron, you probably wouldn't want to do a 1/4 cup of boron per gallon. That would be a whole bunch of boron. So with trace elements, you're going to be using much, much, much less material to get a result, to test the results. Number of flowers per cluster, greater number of flowers, greater number of fruit. Manganese is oftentimes a limiting factor in flower number and fruit set. Quick anecdote here. A friend of mine was working with a farmer, I believe in Pennsylvania. My friend was his consultant, and he, had been on the farmer was on the program. He'd, taken the workshop. He was doing all the protocols, taking the soil tests, doing the mineral balancing, inoculation, foliar sprays. He was even doing the in-season soil test that tells you what's available right now, as opposed to the one we talked about yesterday, which is the what's present in the soil test. He got his report back from his in-season soil test telling him what was present, what was available and what wasn't available. And he said, oh, looks like the manganese level is low. Not enough available manganese. I know what to do. I'll just take some manganese sulfate and solubilize it. So we did, and solubilized it, put it into his irrigation line, and watered it into the hoop house, patted himself on the back. Went to bed that night, woke up at 2 o'clock in the morning, realized he'd done his math wrong, and instead of doing enough manganese for a 2,000 square foot hoop house, he'd done enough manganese for a 20,000 square foot hoop house. Minor math error. called up my friend, his consultant, in a fit of panic because this was a major cash flow. It was like, don't want to fry the tomatoes. He's like, what do I do? Well, you took a soluble salt, dissolved it in water, and then watered it into the ground. You kind of, you can wait and watch. There's not a hell of a lot you can do. We'll see what happens when you overdose your plants on manganese. And what happened was that the next time those plants flowered, instead of setting 4 or 5 flowers per cluster, they set between 12 and 15 flowers per cluster because manganese is a reproductive element. Every element has its functioning effect. An imbalance looks like this, a deficiency looks like this. Manganese is a reproductive element, critically deficient in our food supply because Roundup is a chelator, ties up manganese. Anybody who's followed the reproductive issues that humans are having and manganese deficiency, you could save yourself a lot of money with the IU, what is it called? In vitro fertilization and all that kind of stuff. A little bit of manganese supplementation would really make it a much cheaper process. So plants set 12 to 15 flowers instead of 4 to 5. Those flowers pollinated, set fruit, and because everything else was functioning well, those fruit all filled, and functionally what happened due to a manganese overdose was a tripling of the yield in that flowering cycle, which goes to show that the manganese was a limiting factor because the addition of more manganese tripled the yield. That means that was the thing that was holding the yield back. People talk about these trace elements not being important. University people say, 0.2 parts per million of boron is plenty. Yeah, but what happens when you get 2 parts per million boron is all the rest of the stuff functions at a much higher level. So anyway, when you see your tomato plants go from 4 to 5 flowers per cluster to 3 to 4 to 2 to 3 to 1 to 2, that reproductive energy is diminishing, and it's entirely possible it's manganese that is your limiting factor in that case. And now we're at the level of specific elements and specific correlations. So I'm going to read this first slide here in its entirety. The biochemical process of plant nutrition. This is an order basically of operations in biochemistry. Boron activates silicon, which carries all other nutrients, starting with calcium, which binds nitrogen to form amino acids, DNA, and promote cell division. Amino acids form proteins and tag trace minerals, especially magnesium, to form chlorophyll, which transfers energy via phosphorus to carbon to form sugars, which go where potassium carries them. The point I want to make here is that everything is connected to everything else. And so just because you've got a calcium deficiency doesn't mean adding calcium is going to solve the problem. Right? The more you can understand how these things are related, the more you can understand the classic causal dynamics behind each of these issues, the more you can solve the problem at its root, as opposed to just, adding some element. So we'll start with calcium. Oftentimes, calcium shortages show up in tandem with other shortages, most commonly boron and silicon, as evidenced by the previous slide. Stem and leaf strength and ability to flex and bend are correlated with calcium. So when your plant's leaves and stems are brittle, that means you have not enough calcium in the plant. Strong cell walls, which correlate to fungal resistance, a sign of good calcium presence. So when you have fungal susceptibility, then you have low calcium levels. Roundness of stem is a sign of good calcium presence. Leaves that have a wrinkled appearance and may defoliate is a symptom of calcium deficiency, like your classic green chard, four-took giant green chard. It's springtime, it's looking great, it's growing, it's got these big, broad, glossy looking leaves. Comes July, things start to get a little bit hot and dry, and the leaves that come out are much more ruffled. You ever notice that change in the leaf from flat to ruffle within the plant? That is going from calcium sufficiency to calcium deficiency. When the leaves begin to ruffle, that's one symptom. If you've seen it on corn leaves, maybe you've seen corn leaves that have a little ruffle going up the leaf, up one side and down the other. That's a classic calcium deficiency symptom. When you see ruffling where it otherwise wouldn't be or isn't normally. Adequate calcium correlates to the same leaf size across the plant. Who has seen a cucumber plant that had bigger leaves at the bottom than it did 2 feet down? Or a zucchini plant or a yellow squash plant that had bigger leaves at the bottom than it did 2 or 3 feet down the plant? It should have the same size leaves throughout the plant. As the leaves get smaller, we can see more and more of these deficiencies building up in the plant. Those deficiencies build up, and then the plant gets sick, and then the plant dies. You'll see those leaves come out smaller and smaller before you'll see the powdery mildew come on. The powdery mildew is what happens when You know, it doesn't have what it needs to keep building these things out. And if you are watching the signs, you'll see that happen before the disease occurs. Vine crops will be resistant to powdery mildew with sufficient silicon to synergize with calcium and making very strong cell walls. I think I talked about that already. I said equisetum or horsetail is a wonderful plant that you can use to make a tea, which makes really good bioavailable silicon. In general, I think I said this yesterday, with the cucurbit family plants, my experience has been that the hybrids have a really hard time maintaining that full system function through the growing season. And my experience has been that with the open pollinators, I can get them through the season with resistance to powdery mildew, but with the hybrids, I haven't been able to do it yet. Moving right along here, boron facilitates carbohydrate transport down to the roots and nutrients up to the leaves. Insufficient boron will correlate with a stagnant Brix reading in crops that does not fluctuate during the day. This is my opportunity to talk about Brix. I asked people before if anybody had a refractometer. Does anybody have a refractometer here? No. I'm reticent to bring them on the plane because they get taken away. So I don't have one with me. I'm sorry. We'll just have to make do with that one. So refractometers are measured in degrees Brix. You've heard about how Richter is measured. You know that Richter was a person, that Celsius was a person, Fahrenheit was a dude. And you've heard about Kelvin scale. We were talking about millisiemens before. So Brix was just another one of these white European males from the 1800s that figured out something and got a scale named after him. I think he was an Austrian chemist, and he won the prize put out by the German vintners in the 1830s. The vintners had a problem, which was they were making wine and putting it in the barrels and sticking the barrels in the catacombs and taking the barrels out again 20 years later and finding that some of them were full of vinegar and not wine. And they're like, you know, the barrels take a bunch of work to make, and the catacombs, it's a pain in the butt to dig them out. We'd really rather just put in the grape juice into the barrels that's going to be high quality wine and not the stuff that's going to be vinegar. And we don't really know how to choose which one's which. So this was their question, was who can predict which grape juice will make high quality wine and which grape juice will make vinegar. They put all their money together, put out $1 million prize, and Brix won the prize. Brix figured out that it was the specific gravity of the juice, the more viscous, the more dense, the more stuff per unit volume, the better the quality of the wine. He used a hydrometer to measure it. You know, the specific gravity of water is 1, and then, you know, I think it was, you know, whatever, above 1.2 is going to be a high quality wine, and below 1.2 is going to be vinegar. That basic insight was taken so that we can not have to have a whole barrel of juice to get a reading, but just one drop. It was converted into a refractometer, which is basically you take one drop and put it on a slide, and you look through the other end, and there's like a little scale that you can see. Basically, when you look through the refractometer, you'll see a little scale here, and there'll be a line. And above here it'll be blue, and below here it'll be white. So you basically can say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This Brix reading is 6. So what it measures is refraction. People know about refraction. If you stick your hand in a bathtub full of water, or your arm, it looks like it bends. It's not bending, it's just the light that's bending when it's passing through the water. Everybody knows this. If you actually put some Epsom salts in that bathtub full of water and stir it up, and then put your arm back in there, it'll look like your arm is more bent. And it's not more bent, or even bent at all. It's just that the light is bending more because the dissolved salt in the water is causing the light to refract more. So all a refractometer is doing is telling you how much light is bending when it's passing through a fluid. And basically what happens is the more stuff in the fluid, the more stuff in the juice, either in the sap of the leaf or in the juice of the carrot or the juice of the potato or juice of the grape, the more stuff, the more the light bends. And so refractometer, while not a perfect tool for testing crop quality and plant health, is probably one of the best ones we've got now that actually is a simple empirical metric. People oftentimes have the misconception about Brix or refractometers that they're measuring sugar. This is an absolutely fallacy. It is not measuring sugar. It's a minor pet peeve of mine when people who know better tell other people that Brix is testing sugar. As I just suggested, you can add Epsom salts to water and get a reading. There's no sugar in either water or Epsom salts. You can get a reading on vinegar, on olive oil, on battery acid, on any number of things that don't contain sugar, and you can still get a reading. So then technically, Brix is not measuring sugar. Everybody understands that. It's measuring total dissolved solids. It's measuring the amount of bend of light. When you are getting a drop of juice out of a leaf, there is certainly some sugar in that leaf, but that's not all that's being measured. When you're getting a drop of juice out of a carrot or a cucumber or a potato, there is some sugar in there perhaps, but that is not all that's being measured. So it's a minor pet peeve of mine that people think Brix is measuring sugar and we're talking about quality meaning more sugar. That's not what quality means. Quality does not mean more sugar. It means more total dissolved solids, better flavor, better aroma. Sometimes there's a misunderstanding there. So that all being said, boron, it says, facilitates carbohydrate transport down to the roots and nutrients up to the leaves. Insufficient boron will correlate with a stagnant Brix reading that does not fluctuate during the day. I talked about the refractometer this morning and said this is a great tool to have in your back pocket when it comes to being able to sort of go out into the field and test and see how things are doing. So I would have my refractometer in one pocket and the conductivity meter in the other if you wanted to be, toting 6 guns, like ready to go here. So what you would like to see in a Brix reading would be something along this lines. And this would be a 24-hour cycle. So this is 7 a.m. and this is 7 a.m. here. This is maybe 4 p.m. or so. This variation should be 1 to 2 points. If you have a boron deficiency, what you'll see is it stays the same from 7 a.m. to 4 p.m. to 7 a.m. Boron facilitates carbohydrate transport down to the roots and nutrients up to the leaves. If the plant is making sugar in the leaves to inject into the soil, and the boron deficiency is stopping that process from occurring, what's going to happen? The soil life's not going to get fed. If the soil life doesn't get fed, then what happens? The plant doesn't get fed. The whole system breaks down when you don't have enough boron. It's a really critically important element, and it's one of those elements that I can pretty much guarantee everybody has a deficiency of. Unless you've been adding it recently in significant quantity and are in a hoop house, I pretty much can guarantee you that you are below 3 parts per million of boron in your soil. So if you know you're not going to take a soil test in your secret little heart of hearts, like you know you should and you mean to and you're a good person and you're just probably not going to follow through, I would suggest figure out the max application rate for boron and get that material and get it onto your land. It is a major system breakdown, causal factor in almost everybody's farms on most years. It's really quite exciting how critically important boron is. There's a few nuggets you can leave here with and say, I'm pretty much sure if I do this, it'll be better for me. Inoculating my seed, pretty much go for it. Boron, pretty much go for it. Yes?
If you've had trouble getting your beets to size up, it's boron. That's like a light bulb goes off. You hear that, and they just put the boron out, and all of a sudden their beets are sizing up.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you're applying that at a very low rate, right?
I think we said 30 pounds per acre was the max application rate. So the question, which nobody asked yesterday, about how do you spread 5 pounds per acre of this and 6 pounds per acre of that, is by bulking it up with some other kind of a material. So in simple, what I suggest is, take a wheelbarrow half full of compost or humates or gypsum or whatever, pour all of your trace elements into that, mix it all up, and then pour that out into your 5-gallon buckets. And then you've got enough material that you can spread relatively evenly over your area. But you have to bulk it out with something, generally. Yes?
Fluctuation, what's the best time of the day roughly to take an accurate?
So do you want to be humble or do you want to show off? Humble, show off. I didn't talk about this yet, but one of the best ways to discern relative plant health is with a refractometer. So the general target for the leaf while the plant is growing is 12. You would like to be able to see at any point in time in any of your crops a Brix reading of 12. That means 7 o'clock in the morning. This is where the humility factor becomes really visceral. Is when people whose noses are a bit high in the air go, proudly off to their garden to show off what healthy plants they've got. They get the refractometer out. they get a reading and it's 4.5, and they have to eat some serious crow. And they don't feel comfortable, and they throw the refractometer away and accuse it of being poorly calibrated. And they don't like to talk about Brix reading ever after again because they know that their plants aren't actually healthy. So it's a real interesting tool to really cut through the marketing and the publicity and the ego and everything else to see just how good of a farmer are you. So anybody here who buys crops at a farmer's market, I would suggest the best thing for you to do is to test the crops available before you choose who to buy from. Or go there with a friend of yours or a couple of friends, and you buy from this farmer, you buy from this farmer, and I'll buy from this farmer, and we can all go back to our house together, open a bottle of wine, and test the crops, and then choose who to buy from. And we could even tell our friends. Now, this is where the rubber meets the road, and I suggest the farmers get on the program because the idea here is that we're going to give consumers the ability to test quality in a much more sophisticated manner than a refractometer in short order. And it would be good for you to figure out where you're at and start amending or improving so that you can be at the cutting edge when it's all sort of starts to roll out. But your target reading of 12 on your leaves is the standard. And I suggest humility is appropriate until you are at that point. Once you've achieved the level of functionality where all of your crops have Brix readings of 12, then you can start making comments about, I'd love to offer some advice to anybody who wants to listen. But there's a lot of people who offer a lot of advice who produce really crappy quality crops. And I think a little bit of transparency and more honesty about what's going on would be helpful. And this is a wonderful tool for those who are curious. Yeah?
2 quick questions. The first one is, do you want a reading of 12 at 7 a.m. or at 4 p.m.?
Minimum 12.
Okay.
Yeah.
The second one is, so given that Brix is, I guess, correlated or related to better nutrition?
Overall system function, yes.
Does that mean that to get more nutritionally dense plants, I would want to harvest them at 4 as opposed to 7 a.m.?
The Brix reading goes up and down in the leaf, but it does not go up and down in the carrot or the tomato or the cucumber. Okay. So if you want to be picking your lettuce at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I'd say knock yourself out. Basically, it's the sugar levels that are modulating dramatically during the day because of photosynthesis. So if you're going from 12 to 14, those 2 points are sugar and the other 12 points are other stuff. So it's the other stuff that really is the important stuff anyway. The sugar's not that important as far as I'm concerned.
So if you buy a refractometer from Dan's organization here, they send a chart out that has all the list of crops, different crops, and a poor, average, and a good reading.
This is when you actually harvest the crop. The target is not 12, it's on that chart. So this is how you tell how good this is versus that. So excellent on a cucumber is a different number than excellent on a carrot. We can begin to assess really how well we're doing, and you want to be moving that Brix reading up over time. You want it to be heading in that 12 direction, and when you have a good conductivity level and a good Brix reading in your plants, you're going to see levels of growth, rates of growth, levels of productivity, pest and disease resistance that you had only fantasized about. These 2 data points, in good shape will correlate with overall system function, where you can say, now that is what a healthy plant looks like. That is a bar that I can judge future, performance against. In many cases, I said before, we have this idea that because a plant has green leaves, it's healthy. And I would suggest that when you squish that leaf and you get a Brix reading and you see it's 4.5 or 5, then you can say, no, it's not, actually. It's not sick yet, but it's certainly not flourishing. Yeah.
I mean, I think the biggest thing, based on my experience, has been one of the most noticeable factors is the kind of how long it lasts without going bad, the higher the rating. But the taste, and this is just my own personal subjective experience, but hasn't been as substantial. And if based on some of the stuff you said yesterday with how important the taste is to determine nutrient value, it just...
You've had Brix reading 4 tomatoes and Brix reading 10 tomatoes, and you've tasted them next to each other and you thought they were...
Not substantial. I mean, yes, I've had a really, really good 4 rating tomato. And the varieties are different, obviously, what a brandy wine tastes like versus one of the new, whatever, it doesn't matter. But the point is, Yeah, it's just, I mean,
So it's possible to have a 4 Brix reading tomato, which is relatively quite flavorful, but that is nowhere near the top of the bar. That's what's, I mean, and there's, I mean, the next level of complexity with Brix is that there's a clear line Brix and then there's a fuzzy line Brix. And so sometimes you'll see a really clear delineation, like it is 6. And sometimes you'll see, well, it's certainly above 4, and it's certainly below 8, but this area in here, it's not clearly white or blue. So that's called a fuzzy line Brix, and the broader the fuzzy is, generally the more complex the compounds are, which correlate with flavor and aroma. So you can have a clear line 12 on an apple that's like a simple, okay, it's sweet, but it doesn't have any flavor. Or you can have a fuzzy line 12, which is a much more complex experience. So the refractometer is not the be-all and end-all. It is a simple, inexpensive, no batteries, use it 10,000 times, keep it in your back pocket, you know, empirical tool from the 1830s. It's better than nothing. But it is not the be-all and end-all. And there's no question that your tongue is the most sophisticated nutrient monitoring device. And each person's body has different biochemical imbalances, and so what is actually good and flavorful to you might not be to somebody else because you need certain things that are different from that other person needs. So if we're ever going to try to simplify this whole thing down, we're going to have to just sort of, I mean, it'll never be as good as our tongue is. So I'm not sure if that addresses a couple of the points you're making. I think they're totally relevant. And stop saying argumentative, please. Because you're just asking thoughtful questions, as far as I can tell. Yeah.
Yeah, so you said that Brix reading doesn't go up and down in the actual
Fruit.
So when is the fruit, at what part of the process is it endowed with the reading that it's going to have? So say your plant is at a 6 or so, and your fruit produces, and you can then steadily increase the reading of your plant, so that fruit stays the same? Like when?
So, I mean, as long as the plant is putting nutrients into the fruit or into the root or whatever it is the part that you're harvesting, as long as it's putting nutrients in, the Brix reading matters. As soon as you pick it, then you've got what you've got. I'm not sure if that answers your question or not.
Kind of, and maybe the question is kind of silly. I'm not sure if I'm explaining it right. Just like, so if you have a 4 tomato and your plant then is obviously probably fluctuating between a 3 or 5 or whatever at that point. How do you, like, is it when the fruit is created that it's endowed with a 4? You know, once you raise your levels of plant, maybe.
It's a continuum. The whole process of the fruit from the pollination to harvest is constantly, the environmental conditions are affecting what it's going to taste like. So.
Brix reading is, say, a 10 or a 12.
Yeah.
But it's fluctuating on the leaf where you're testing it, but you're not testing your vegetable. So she's confused, I think, about where the fluctuation is happening.
The fluctuation happens in the leaf, not in the fruit. Right. Yeah. So, but her question was really, at what point does it stop? When is the decision made for when the fruit is going to have this number, and the final decision is made when you pick it. So if you pick a tomato raw, like they do in Florida, to sell to other people after gassing them, that plant hasn't put into the fruit anywhere near as much nutrition as it would have if it had been allowed to grow until it was ripe. So stuff that's picked raw will never be able to compete with stuff that's been picked ripe if we have consumers paying attention to quality and not aesthetic. Does that make sense? Which I think is kind of an inbuilt incentive for the small local farmers to do better than big operations. Anybody ever had what they call a peach from the grocery store?
They don't have peaches here.
There's peaches that you can get on the tree that are ripe. That is one experience. And then there's a peach, I'm not sure if it's like that down here, but where I live, nectarines, peaches, these things that when they're good, they're amazing. And when they're from the store, they're going to be this pulpy, repugnant mess. Right? Amen. So when they're picked ripe, they have all those things added to them that weren't there when they were picked raw so they could ship. Right? Ripe peaches don't ship very well because they're peaches. They're just this delicate, amazing, sensuous deliciousness. They're not designed to be shipped and kept in storage for weeks for the industrial supply chain.
So I've only seen a refractometer used on pasture grasses.
Yeah.
Is the reading gonna be the same in a leaf and a tomato, more or less? Like, do I assume that if it's going 10, 12, 10, 12, that the tomato is somewhere on that line? Or is the tomato it's on its own, but the fruit of a plant isn't necessarily reflecting the bricks in the leaf at a given point in time?
The number on the leaf and the number in the fruit are not necessarily connected.
That was what I was asking.
Yeah. A 6 is an excellent reading on a cucumber, and you'll only get that with a 12 reading in the leaf. A 20 is an excellent reading in a grape. You'll get that with a 12 reading in the leaf. Adequate levels of calcium in the soil and in the bottom of the plant. Your soil test says you have enough calcium. The bottom leaves are big and broad, but not in the top of the plant. So you have small leaves in the periphery of the plant. When your leaves get smaller in the cucumber, when the leaves get smaller in the tomato, when the leaves get smaller in the summer squash, as those leaves get smaller and smaller, that's a symptom of, it's called a calcium deficiency because there's not enough calcium in the plant, but it's actually caused by a boron deficiency. You'll get these calcium deficiency symptoms when you don't have enough boron in your soil. Really very important element. Sulfur, old leaves turn yellow and don't drop. Anybody's ever seen the bottom leaves on a broccoli or a Brussels sprout that's yellow? Just sits there, hangs out, he's yellow, doesn't get sick, doesn't get diseased, doesn't dry up, doesn't fall off. Sulfur deficiency. Bottom leaf on an onion or a garlic or a leek turn yellow and just hang out there. All, for a month at a time, 2 months at a time, yet the bottom leaf is just sitting there yellow. That's a classic sulfur deficiency symptom.
You ever at any point kind of prematurely harvesting plants and looking at the parts of the plant that you can't normally see to make a determination as to the overall health?
Should I or do I?
Yes.
Yes and no.
Okay.
It would be good for us to start dissecting things and watching things, taking things apart. You can do it much easier with an orchard, with grasses in an orchard than you can with tomato plants. You don't really want to be chopping tomato plants in half if you got them on 5-foot spacing. All things in moderation, but I think it's a really wonderful thing to do, to go in there and start looking at stuff and cutting them open and looking at the pith. And is the pith white or is the pith dark? Or the roots, cut the roots in half and see what the color of the roots are, see if things are backed up. There's a ton you can see by looking that a lot of us don't ever actually engage in. So in general, yes.
Are these new discoveries that we're making, or are you reaching back in time to finding old books or finding old sources?
1940s USDA, formal published literature. Yeah, there's some new stuff coming out, and I could probably update this a little bit, but a lot of this is 70 years old, not new information. Potassium is a transport element and a catalyst in plant sizing. Potassium deficiency will show up on the leaf or the fruit or the stem if the size is not there. Lack of potassium is obvious in the size and shape of the fruit. The delicious apple shape is a classic symptom of a potassium deficiency. Anybody seen that full on top, pinched on the bottom shape on a cucumber? Summer squash, zucchini, full on top, pinched on the bottom. Yeah, the blossom end doesn't fill out. That's a classic potassium deficiency symptom. If you have seen tomato plants where the first fruits come out, 12-ounce fruits, and then they're 8 ounces, and then they're 10 ounces. The 10 ounces and 8 ounces and 6. They get smaller and smaller as they proceed through the fruit. You've seen cherry tomatoes start off as these nice big fruits and then get smaller and smaller through the season. I remember being at our local health food store and seeing this quart of tomatoes, cherry tomatoes on the counter that must have had like 150 cherry tomatoes in it. It was a quart, but they were so small. It was October, and I'm like, how long did it take to pick this quart of cherry tomatoes? You've seen that happen when the fruits get smaller and smaller? Classic potassium deficiency symptom. Thin calyxes, thin stems, thin leaves, small fruit are potassium deficiency symptoms. In vine crops, you'll see a light or yellow band on a cucumber leaf, a little yellow band is right on the edge of the leaf, all the way around. It's a little bit yellowish. In tomatoes, bottom leaves curling up that turns into early blight is actually a potassium deficiency. Let me just lay this one out for you here. What is the foundational cause of a lot of these similar symptoms? Potassium, they say, is an electrolyte. When the soil dries out, the potassium as I understand it, adheres to the soil colloid, so the available levels drop off dramatically. It's not that it's not there, it's just that it's not available. So when the soil dries out, potassium availability drops off, and potassium is used to fill fruits, to fill up roots, to fill fruits. And so when the soil dries out and the plant doesn't have available what it needs to fill out its fruit, it does what a pregnant mother would do when she doesn't have enough calcium. It sucks it out of her bones. So when we have that symptom of the tomato leaves turning yellow at the bottom, what they're doing is they're sucking the potassium out of their bottom leaves to fill their fruit. It's called senescence. They're sacrificing the part of their body they can afford to sacrifice because what they need from the soil is not available. And they're going to literally sacrifice their life force, their body, for their babies. So pulling off their leaves is not solving the problem. Keeping the soil moist solves the problem. The only issue with this here is that it takes about 2 or 3 months after you've rehydrated the soil for all of the potassium that was available to be available again. It doesn't all just turn back on and become reavailable. It just takes 2 to 3 months to become available again. Maintaining hydration is of foundational importance. You really short circuit a whole bunch of things when you let that soil dry out. It's a really big piece of the puzzle. I hope I've emphasized it sufficiently in numerous different manners in this presentation. Hydration is really important. It really does, lack of hydration short circuit a lot of things through the growing season. Yeah.
So I had my soil test back when we were in a drought.
Yeah.
And I sent that in, and I've got a low potassium number. Mm-hmm. Is that an indication from the fact that my soil maybe was dry, or can they pick that potassium up?
The test we're about to talk about would show the difference between dry soil and moist soil, the available versus present. This test you've got should show what's basically present in the soil. Present being different from available. Okay. Yeah. So it shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter. Okay, magnesium is used to produce chlorophyll, which turns the plant sap a deep true green. High levels of magnesium will cause a very dark sap, which generally shows a healthy plant. In many cases, if you are actually out there testing your plants and you're actually squishing the leaf every week and looking at the color of the leaf, you'll notice that the color is not very dark. That dark color is chlorophyll, in which sugar is manufactured, which is critical to feeding the soil life. So when you have light-colored plant sap, that means you are not feeding your soil life very much. Does that make sense? Magnesium, easily found in Epsom salts, is oftentimes the limiting factor in that darkening of the plant sap. So a foliar spray of not much Epsom salt can dramatically increase the plant sap, the chlorophyll and the sugar manufacture and the whole system function. Yeah?
Magnesium in humans is really hard to replenish in terms of if you have a deficiency. I'm wondering with plant life, if you put it in, it goes in?
If you take your Epsom salts and you solubilize them in water and mix them with a little bit of humates and foliar spray them onto the leaf surface, it goes in.
I think as you're explaining, there are all these cofactors, all these other additional minerals that are necessary, and maybe that's why, the science is saying magnesium is difficult for the human body to absorb because we're missing the boron.
We're missing the manganese and the cobalt and the copper and the zinc because we've had the glyphosate for 30 years and our biochemistry is screwed up and yeah.
But if it's there in the soil or if it's there on the leaves, it gets absorbed. There's nothing. If all the synergistic elements are present,
I don't think there's any problem with it being absorbed. I've certainly seen leaf sap color dramatically darken, in short order after applying a foliar spray with magnesium in it. Yeah, it's pretty quick. If that's what you're missing, you'll see the color change. You'll see the numbers rise. You'll see change happen. Phases of nutritional need up to the first blossoming. There's microbial needs. Really, it's important to make sure that the soil life is established well and is flourishing. There needs to be sufficient water, of course, and good sugar coming down from the leaf. The Brix reading is a good way to tell roughly how much is being manufactured and therefore injected into the soil. If you're getting Brix readings of 4 and 5, you can assume that you're probably not feeding your soil life enough to get them to establish well for to have a really productive year. If it's cloudy out for a week, not much sugar is being manufactured in the leaf, that probably the soil life isn't being fed very well. So What's the simple thing you can do if you think that the plant's soil life's not being fed enough sugar? Add sugar. See, yeah, you can use straight sugar, you can use molasses, you can use honey, you can use maple syrup. I mean, you can take these sugary materials and dissolve a quart of it per acre and irrigate it into your soil, and you can stimulate the biological system quite rapidly with something as simple as that. It's really exciting if you begin to understand how these things all piece together, how you can put your finger on the scale to try to support overall system function. We don't need to be passive and say, oh, the weather, crop failure because of the weather. No, if you understand the weather and its effect on the system, then you can systemically support to, overweigh whatever the imbalance is that was caused. Subsequently, when the plant begins to blossom and set fruit, nutrient demands begin to increase as the plant goes through its hormonal and reproductive shifts. At fruit fill, nutritional demand increases even more. I've got written down boron, calcium, manganese, sulfur, phosphorus, magnesium, cobalt are all needed. The idea is that if you sense an imbalance coming up or deficiency, or it's wintertime and you want to support the immune system, you can either wait for the child to get sick and then give them drugs, or you can give them vitamins and nutrition and keep them from getting sick in the first place. So in this case, the metaphor would be you can either wait for your plants to get sick, in which case you have to give them fungicides or insecticides, or you can feed them and prevent them from getting sick in the first place. So my general strategy has been a prophylactic, proactive feeding regimen, which is along the lines of a quart of concentrate per acre as a foliar spray, a half a gallon in the soil. Like I said before, the idea is I'll do it once a week, and in many cases I don't for a couple of months at a time if things look like they're doing well. But being sensitive and seeing when they're starting to go off and not quite be as flourishing as they were, and then supporting them with food, I think is a totally legitimate practice. So for those who are willing to consider such things, I generally refer to it as cheating. If you have a good foliar program, a good feeding program, you can grow plants that look like they're really healthy, even if you're not that good of a farmer. So if anybody ever wants to show off when they don't deserve to, just feed your plants more well. It really being legit is like putting them in the ground and saying, you guys got everything, go for it. That's like the real deal. If you can figure that one out, you're in good shape. But not all of us are there, and we still actually want to make a living and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, these are some of the things that would be needed in more and more increasing levels as the plant has greater demands. Discerning deficiency in Brix, I think I talked about all that. The only thing I didn't say was that you should take your Brix readings at the same time of day every week if you're going to be doing it. So do 7 a.m. all the time, don't do 7 a.m. one week and then 4 p.m. the next week. And the other piece is always to take a leaf from the same part of the plant. Don't do the top of the plant one week and the bottom of the plant the next week. What I've got recommended here is that you take a leaf, like the newest fully formed leaf, which might be the 4th newest leaf. The newest leaf is just a bud that just opened. The second newest leaf is at 1/3 size, etc. So the newest fully formed leaf would be your one you'd want to be using for your reading every week. In general, once a plant shows deficiency symptoms, you've limited the genetic potential of that crop in that year. A bunch of suggestions here for a little bit more proactive monitoring and management. These slides are basically driving towards the saturated paste test, which is the one that tomato farmer was doing who gave his plants too much manganese. The metrics for a saturated paste, the target levels are at the top of page 9 there. Biggest problem with the saturated paste test is you can't mix the samples between your cucumbers and your carrots and your potatoes and your apple trees. You need to do one for the carrots, one for the cucumbers, one for the potatoes. So if you actually want to test all your crops, you're looking at hundreds of dollars for one response. So I'm guessing that's not appropriate from most of the people who are here. So I'm going to skim over that. If you do want to take a saturated paste test, it's the same form as the other test. There's just there's a checkbox in the bottom. You check the saturated paste box instead of the base plus box. And the target levels are here on the top of page 9. So you can see roughly what's low. Yes?
Could you explain a little bit more? I ended up doing the saturated paste test on the soil sample, and there are like 4 different crops that I'm planting in the soil. So
the saturated paste test will tell you what's available right now. And it changes on a weekly basis. So if you took a saturated paste test a month ago for things you're going to be planting this week, what it said then is irrelevant. This is a test that tells you what's available right now. And so if you know your plants are about to go from that, that stage when they go from like, oh, they're nice little plants to, oh, they all of a sudden they're now tomato plants. You know when that happens? Like they were little broccolis and now they're broccoli plants. They were like, it's like this, it happens overnight when they go from like children to whatever it is. Yeah, there's like a shift that happens. So the idea is if you're going to do it once in the plant's life cycle, that's a really good time to do it, is when they're about to hit puberty and start building their adult body and probably getting pregnant. You want to make sure they have access to everything they need to go through that process well.
So then you can supplement.
Then you'd want to be doing a saturated paste test if you want to be managing that intensively, and then you can target. You can say, look, I can see specifically that these 3 elements are low, therefore I'm going to supplement with them. So that is for people who are operating on any kind of significant scale, whose crops are worth thousands of dollars per crop. You could make significant more money if you managed a little bit more actively at these critical junctures. And that's what the previous sort of 5 or 6 slides are trying to convey. Simple solutions for those who do not want to bother with plant sap monitoring and soil conductivity testing, et cetera. The idea is a regular prophylactic foliar spray and drench. I talked about that already. This last slide before the break says biological process. This is just a recap of what I ended the workshop with yesterday, which is the order of complexing of compounds, which correlates with the pest and disease resistance. This is the natural break point before my conclusion. We have about an hour and a half left in the day. Are there any quick questions before we have a break and reconvene? Yes.
Your gentleman you were talking about, Reams, did he have any published material?
There's no book by Reams. Some of his students have done books. Badeau, I think, is one of the better ones. Alexander Badeau. Dan Scow has a book on Reams. The biggest problem with Reams was he was a clairvoyant. And, he was not a problem, but I used to teach this course based on Reams method agronomy, sort of taking a Reams soil test and balancing it according to his principles. And whenever there'd be legitimate scientists in the room, agronomists, they'd say, well, where's your citation for these claims? And I'm like, some clairvoyant said it's true. And he got amazing results too. And they were just sort of like, so I made a strategic decision early on to hide behind Albrecht and his PhD university credentials as an entree into this conversation to get people who are perhaps more skeptical to at least listen to what I'm having to say. And then hopefully by the time I got to this point in the course, they're down the rabbit hole with me and we can go off the deep end and everything's all set. So it's a con game, really. I mean, it's a big, I think Badeau's book is probably one of the better ones. It's more expensive than it should be. Reams talked about how he didn't care whether an atom in chemistry had an extra electron to share or needed an electron, which is the conventional definition of cation and anion. He cared which direction it was spinning. He said some elements spin this direction and has the effect of, enhancing growth. Some elements spin this direction and have the effect of enhancing reproduction. And he called them male and female. He called them cations and anions, which is a different definition of cation and anion. When he balanced his soil tests, he said it was always had to have a balanced number of male and female elements. It was really, really, clear about this. His story about Reams was, one of many, many stories. But he was a student of Einstein's and, was hanging out with him in the 40s and, said basically, so Al, you figured out how to take matter apart. Good job. Referring to the atom bomb. How do you put it back together again? I guess this is how physicists joke around. Reams. And Al said to Carrie, that's your job, Carrie, figure it out. And so he did. He figured out, he went down deep and sussed this thing out and was able to get results. I said before, he was able to get a green bean to grow from planting to harvesting in 3 weeks. He got down pretty deep on how, life builds form. RBTI is this sort of the frame, Reams' biological theory of ionization, if you want to look it up. He was responsible for taking something like 20,000 people from, go home and die stages of stage 4 cancer and things like that. And with the use of a refractometer and a conductivity meter, he could test your urine and saliva, never meet you, and say, you have colon cancer, you are about to have a heart attack, you're going to get an aneurysm, you need some lemonade, you need some vinegar, and you need some calcium. And not calcium carbonate, but calcium lactate. He had this thing figured out so slick, it was pretty damn impressive. He got in trouble with the FDA. Part of the problem of curing people is you piss off people in power. We'll talk about Wilhelm Reich after the break, another person who got his books burned by the FDA. Remember the Nazis and how they were burning books and how bad that was? You ever heard that one, that story? Those evil Nazis burning books in the 1940s? How about the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, US FDA, burning books in the 1950s? You don't hear that story, right? Anyways, all right, so we'll get there. Any other questions, comments before we take a break? No. All right, looks like 35 after, so we'll call it quarter of.